Hello and welcome to Heilman and Haver, Seattle's stage and screen experience, coming to you in podcast form from Casa de Quinn and 1111 Studios on the shores of beautiful Puget Sound. I'm Greg Heilman.
And I'm Matt Haver. Back in 2020, we took to the internet airwaves to interview talented local actors and directors. And now, over 75 episodes later, Heilman and Haver is, thanks to you, our loyal listeners, Seattle's #1 stage and screen podcast, bringing you in-depth interviews with the finest talent from LA to Broadway to the UK, including Emmy Award winners, best-selling authors, unsung heroes, and industry leaders.
And all while keeping our finger on the pulse of the Seattle and Pacific Northwest theater scene with in-depth reviews, cast and crew conversations, awards, and behind-the-scenes tours. You can find it all at heilmanandhaver.com, and while you're there, sign up for our free email newsletter so you don't miss a single update or episode.
Speaking of episodes, welcome to episode 76. Joining us today is Kristen Lopez, author of the new book, But Have You Read the Book? 52 literary gems that inspired our favorite films. In it, Kristen offers an endlessly fascinating look at 52 beloved screen adaptations and the great reads that inspired them. Some films, like Clueless, Amy Heckerling's interpretation of Jane Austen's Emma, diverge wildly from the original source material, while others, like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, shift the point of view to craft a different experience within the same story. Kristen explores just what makes these works classics of both the page and screen, and why each made for an exceptional adaptation, whether faithful to the book or exemplifying cinematic creative license.
Kristen is a pop culture essayist, TV editor for IndieWire, and she's worked as an entertainment journalist for over 15 years, with her articles appearing at Variety, MTV, TCM, and on Roger Ebert. A California native, Kristen was raised in a small suburb near Sacramento and graduated with a master's in English from California State University, Sacramento. She's also the creator of the classic film podcast Ticklish Business. In her free time, Kristen enjoys reading and finding old Hollywood connections in her neighborhood. She joins us from that neighborhood in Los Angeles. Welcome to the show, Kristen.
Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. There's nothing that Greg and I love more than talking to authors here on this show, because we find that oftentimes authors are the ones with the real scoop on what's going on in Hollywood. Sometimes they even know more than their subjects, because in retrospect, they do know more, right? Do you find that as an author? Do you run into those kind of situations?
Considering this is my first book, I haven't had it specifically with this one, but I mean, I am a journalist in my just general career. So, that happens all the time.
I'll bet. Well, you're a lot of things, but you're both a writer and a cinephile. So which came first, love of books and writing, or your love of movies? Did it all just kind of happen at once?
I definitely loved movies, first and foremost. My house was always filled with movies. My mom probably let me watch way too many movies that I should not have watched as a young child. We were always going to the drive-in when that was a thing. So the movies were always a huge part of my life. And then eventually, I started to delve into writing once I got into middle school and high school. I was always a person that was writing stupid little short stories, crafting my own newspaper, so writing came very early to me as well, but it wasn't until I got into high school that it really became a thing. But it was never something that I thought I'd make money off of or use as a living. I just figured I'd do it until I could get a quote unquote real job. And so far the real job has not developed. So I've just kind of just kept at it, and it's become my career. And now, the two dovetail, and I get to actually write about movies. So it's kind of come full circle.
Well, you mentioned this is your first book. How did you approach the research to this? Is it different than your standard journalistic, reporting or research? And then the big question is, did you read the book first, or did you watch the film first, or vice versa?
That's the big one.
The thing that I tell people, the best way I can describe the process of actually putting this together was it reminded me a lot of taking my master's exam. So in order to get my master's, we had to take a test that required us reading, I think, 100 books in a semester. And, the rule was you were supposed to read everything, but not everybody did. But so essentially it required you to read, I think for my master's exam, I read 50. And, taking notes and being able to kind of make connections. But I had a whole semester in order to, and I didn't have a job. So it was a lot easier than it was now. So the process for this was very similar in the sense that I had to really rigorously schedule. So every Sunday I would watch the movie, and then I would break up the week from Sunday to Friday with however many chapters. So I would have to read the chapters in that span of time, and then Saturday I would write the chapter, and then Sunday it would start all over again with the next movie. So I tended to prioritize stuff in terms of how much research I needed to give. So highest priority were movies that I had never seen and books I had never read. And then from there it was, kind of like, oh, this movie I've seen, but the book I haven't read. Book I've read, but the movie I haven't seen. And then finally it was movies I've read and books I've read. Those tended to be something where I could maybe skim a bit more. If there was a silver lining to a pandemic, it was that I had no social life at the time, so I could kind of just hang out and do my day job during the day and maybe have the movie on in the background and then get to read, on my lunch break or after work. So it really did remind me that, like, oh, if I, really commit, I can relive my college days as much as I probably don't want to. But in terms of the writing process, it was hard because I only had so many pages to fill. Most of the chapters are very short. We had a very tight word count. So I had to be able to tell a story in a very finite amount of words. So oftentimes it would be like, what is the most fascinating things from the book? The notes that I had written for each book and movie are far longer than the actual chapters ended up being. And then from there it was, once I kind of knew the things I wanted to hit, outside research, anything else interesting. So that required me to, watch bonus features or read what other writers had written about the movies or the books in the interim years. So it was kind of like tracking a news story, albeit with far less space, and, trying not to be snarky as much as I wanted to be in some instances. And always remembering that the goal is for people to read the book, so make sure that I was talking about the book as much as I was talking about the film.
Now, did you come in with any preconceived notion, or did you come in open-minded to whether or not books and their movies are, of the same, level of quality or anything like that?
I was always a fan of adaptations, and I'm very impatient. The reason I took this project on, one of many reasons, was that I am somebody that will immediately go out and buy the book. If it's got somebody that I love in it, I'll go buy the book. I'm like, I need to know how invested I should be in this movie, because I can't wait a year or 2 years to find out what happens. I need to be spoiled now. So I've always done that for as long as I can remember. And my assumption had always been that all movies are different than the book that they're based on. There's always crucial changes. No book is verbatim like the movie, and vice versa. And what I really came away with after reading all 52 books and seeing all 52 movies is just the art of adaptation. It really is an art, because I think there is this misguided belief that a screenwriter has an easy job doing adaptation. You have the book, just do whatever the book does and it's totally fine. Or don't do what the book does and just, get to use the characters. Like, there is some sort of level of ease associated with it. And that's really not true, because you have to please two different audiences. You have to tell the same story, but in a different way for a different medium. And that's really challenging. And even if you're translating a story verbatim, something like, the Coen brothers with No Country for Old Men, you're still trying to appease a different audience in a different format than the book. And that is a real challenge.
So how did you select the 52? Was that handed to you by your editors? Did you have a significant amount of input? Get your favorite ones in there, that sort of thing?
It was really a back and forth thing with TCM. They had requirements for me. I think the one book and movie that they wanted was Dune, because that was what was coming out at the time that I was writing it. So that was already kind of, they're like, you have to do it. I'm like, but I don't want to. And they're like, we don't care. You need to include it. So the original short list that I gave them was stopped at Jurassic Park, because I had assumed that we wanted classic. And they're like, Kristen, adaptation didn't end in 95. You need to do more contemporary stuff. So we went back and forth at that point. We both agreed that we wanted a diversity of authors. We wanted a diversity of genres, eras, make sure there's women directors, women authors, people of color. So we knew we wanted all of those things. And then it just became kind of going back and forth. This book is out of print, so we can't include this. This movie is hard to find. There had to be a certain level of name recognition. I always joke with people that if I had had my way, there would be adaptations on here that nobody cares about except me, movies that nobody saw, books that nobody read. It would just be stuff that Kristen likes, and then nobody would buy it. So there had to be a certain level of name recognition to most of the things. I knew that I did not want to include books that I hated, because the job is, the title is, but have you read the book? I want people to read the book. So I tended to not include books that I did not like. So that was a challenge. And then we had to make sure they were actual books. So there were a couple books that I wanted to include that were actually short story collections, or they were novellas. They had to be full length. So there was a lot of back and forth, and TCM would catch things, that I had included. They're like, this is a novella, you can't include it. I would catch things where it's like, this book is out of print, we can't use it. And then eventually the number just kind of kept slowly changing. I wish I could say I was smart enough to have thought of a book a week for a year, and that's where 52 came from. No, it literally, at a certain point, I just said 52. I think I could do that. So there was no thought involved at the end of that. It was just like, I can work with this.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, actually. That'd be a great way to kind of digest the book. It's very easy to sit down and read a short selection the way that you have it formatted, which I really enjoy because I like those little kind of tidbits. And then if you're a quick reader, maybe you can get through the book in a week, but you can certainly get to the movie and then get your book list going. I always think of one of my favorite, I guess, short stories, novellas, is Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption, which ended up being, maybe not immediately, but a blockbuster, complete cult following for that film. It's on stage here, actually, in Tacoma, running this month. And so it's been adapted many different times, but it was part of a collection, so different seasons, so didn't make the book.
Yeah, the one book I really wanted to include was We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, which is what they used for Total Recall, because I love Total Recall. And they, it's a novella. We couldn't include it. And so I was like, I begrudgingly said, okay, we'll do Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, which is what they based Blade Runner off of. And I had never seen Blade Runner, never read the book. It was not my first choice, but I ended up watching it, of course, and reading the book, and it was a great experience. So I was happy to include it. I did kind of cheat a little on the novella side. I have Coraline in there. Coraline's a very brief book, but they consider it a book. I don't really know why. And Nella Larsen's Passing is also novella length, and I included it just because, if I'm including Dune, then I'm including the other popular adaptation of that year, which was Passing. So I felt like that was my kind of like sticking it to the man type of moment.
Got it in there.
Was Dune the extent of the drudgery of the work as far as what you didn't want to do? And then follow up on the other side, was there something that really surprised you, that jumped out and thought, man, this is really good?
For me, reading Dune, it was definitely not the one that I wanted to read. It was not nearly as bad as I had anticipated. I only had to read like half the book because the film, the new version, is only half of the book. So if there's ever a volume 2, I'm going to have to go back and actually read the rest of the book and then watch the other half of the movie. So I'm not looking forward to that. But, for me, I think, there were other books that I kind of dreaded. I did not want to reread Clockwork Orange. I'd read it in college and I didn't like it. I did not like the movie. It was the one that I was like, is there any way I can maybe avoid having to like enmesh myself in this world again? And it definitely was a hard sit again, which I anticipated. So that was the one I probably dreaded more than Dune, but I think what I was really surprised by was reading Ian Fleming's Dr. No for the first time.
Yeah.
I'd never seen a Sean Connery James Bond before this. I'd seen like Brosnan through to today, but I had not seen a Connery one, and I expected it to be like horrifically sexist and offensive. And the book is very dated. It is very, I think, offensive in some of its depictions of women and disabled people. But at the same time, watching how the movie translates those things, it's actually a great example, I think, of a movie that is better than its source material, just because it understands what an audience is going to tolerate.
What do you think makes for a successful adaptation then? It's obviously not necessarily easier than starting from scratch and writing a screenplay, even though the source material is right there. But obviously, you've read through all these things. You've seen all these examples. What do you think makes a successful adaptation?
I've been fortunate to talk to screenwriters who have done adaptations, and it's a question I ask them, because I'm like, you guys are the ones actually doing the job. And for them, they've said that, it's about capturing the spirit of the book. And I think that that's really important. It's about capturing what a reader loves about the source material, because as I mentioned earlier, you're trying to appease two disparate groups of people, right? So you're trying to appease the people that have read the book and love the book. And you're also trying to get this audience of people that maybe have never heard of this story, never just want to see a good movie, just want to be entertained. And those are two very disparate audiences. But if you can capture part of what makes you love this piece of writing, I think your job is kind of started for you. There's a quote that I use in the book from W.S. Van Dyke, who was the director of the Thin Man series. And when he gave the book to the screenwriters of that film, he said, use the book as a foundation and not a guide. And I think that's, again, another great piece of advice, to take the book as a springboard and be able to build upon that without losing that spirit. And I think that good adaptations, can at least conjure up some feeling where you're like, oh, I want to read this book now. Maybe the book is not something I've known about, but I want to know more about it because I love this world. I love these characters, and vice versa. So I think that that's the best way to approach an adaptation, where you have the spirit of it.
Well, two series that I think, in my opinion, hit the mark are both the Harry Potter series and Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. And I think because of what you're saying, it's the essence. I mean, not every detail is there. Some are changed, et cetera, for the sake of storytelling, but it's the essence of the stories that seem to translate from the book to the movies. In your opinion, what films stuck closely to the source material and found success in that way?
I think that the great example is the Coen brothers, No Country for Old Men. That book is verbatim the movie. The Coen brothers pick the same scenes. They use it's almost like you're reading a script when you're reading the book. What I love about it, though, is that Cormac McCarthy's book is very dark, very angry, very politicized. And the Coen brothers take all of those same scenes and add just a great dose of like dark comedy to it. They add nuance. They add something different that even though you're reading the same lines as what is in the book, there's just something different where you're like, oh, okay, I still get that darkness. I still get that grit, but maybe it's a bit humorous, it's cheeky in some way, which I really, really appreciated. I think another great example is something like Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park is very different book to movie, but the spirit is there. They're both really thrilling. They're both, cinematic in scope, even though they have different plot lines and different characterizations. But you can read the book and see the movie. And most people have seen the movie first. It's very hard to find somebody that's read the book before. But you can have either one, approach it from either angle, and lose nothing by knowing the other exists. You get just as much fun engaging with either source of the text.
Yeah, I totally agree on both of those. I love Cormac McCarthy, and Jurassic Park is hands down one of my favorite books of all time. I actually just read another one and then watched the film recently, The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. Also pretty close to the source material, which I was very pleased to find because I enjoyed the book immensely and thought it was really well written. And I love seeing that when the book is so well written, they don't have to do a whole lot to make it cinematic and make it enjoyable to a completely different audience. Now, here's the kicker. Here's the other side. What film diverged the most from its source material and still remains successful?
Oh, gosh, which film diverges? I think the best example is Jaws. To throw Spielberg in there again.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've gotten as much vitriol from people. When people critique the book, they always bring up Jaws. I have had people say to me, why did you include Jaws? The book is trash. Why would you ask people to read the book? The book is garbage. And I was like, I didn't realize that, because when I was doing the short list, I was like, Jaws has to be on there. It's the film that cemented the summer season, but most people don't know it's based on a book. They assumed that
Right.
Steven Spielberg just conjured it from his head. And so I was really fascinated by that before I even started writing. And then I read the book and I was like, this is weird. I'm like, because it's impossible. You'll get maybe a certain generation of people that remember the book before the movie, but it's becoming smaller and smaller. So most people are coming at it from having seen the film. And I think that the reason people hate it so much is that it can never be the movie. You expect something that is on par, and you don't want to see a movie where, Hooper looks like Brad Pitt, or is described as being such and has a really explicit affair with Ellen Brody. I remember reading that being like, oh God, because I'm just seeing Richard Dreyfuss in my head. Or this big mob plot line, and really it's about capitalism because it's about the economy of Amity. But yet the book was a bestseller when it came out. The book was huge. So clearly it was very popular. And I think that that's what's really fascinating. Is the book good? I thought it was perfectly fine. I did not hate it. I don't think it's a terrible book, but it does show you how a film can just start smother its source material and become bigger than that. I think another great example, I didn't include it in the book because I was not going to read it. It's way too long, is like Gone with the Wind. I know that Margaret Mitchell's book goes far more in depth than the film does, but yet you would be hard pressed to find somebody that's actually read Margaret Mitchell's very voluminous text. So those are the ones that I definitely point to, as examples. One that I didn't include because, again, I wanted to pick books that I liked is American Psycho. I love American Psycho, the film, and the book. I know Bret Easton Ellis, who wrote the book, hates the movie, and I feel like he hates it because it's not as good. The book isn't as good as the movie. I feel like he might be jealous. But I think that the movie is just such a great encapsulation on the themes, and it's more enjoyable than reading the book. So yeah, those are the ones that I look at when I talk about like divergence and coming at the source material that way.
Quick follow-up on that is you mentioned Bret Easton Ellis. Now, there's obviously it's pretty well known that Stephen King did not care for Kubrick's Shining.
Yeah.
Are there any other examples that come to mind of? I mean, I suppose when the author signs over the rights, it's kind of, hey man, it's out of my hands. There's only so much you can do except gripe after the fact. But pretty vocal about not caring for what's now considered really a masterpiece of horror. Any other authors really turn their nose up at what happened to their movies?
Oh yeah, a lot of them do.
Probably most of them, huh?
Dashiell Hammett, when he did The Thin Man, he wrote the first Thin Man. He tried very hard for years to write a sequel, never did. Most people are very surprised to find out that The Thin Man is a one-off book. And he tried very hard to do a sequel. He could not do it. And he did not like what they did with the film, and then pretty much just jump shipped after 2. Roald Dahl hated Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, hated it. Thought Gene Wilder was too silly, didn't like it at all. And it took him years. It took people saying to him, this is how a generation of children have gotten into your work, for him to finally like begrudgingly say like, okay. Jack Finney, who did Invasion of the Body Snatchers, really didn't like that, that so many people were ascribing like themes to the book. People were saying it's a story about capitalism, it's a story about communism, it's a story about consumerism, and he was just like, I don't really think it's about anything. So he didn't really care for the way that people were infusing meaning. One of my favorite stories is To Have and Have Not, that they adapted in 1942. It's
just read that too,
yeah, based on an Ernest Hemingway novel. And Hemingway hated the film that they made, mostly because Howard Hawks, who was the director, bet him while they were out in Florida that he could make a great adaptation out of one of Hemingway's worst books. And Hemingway said, sure, let's do it. But the problem is that he found out later on that Hawks made so much money just shopping the rights, and he got like a flat fee. So he was just more irked that he didn't get paid for it. And he also hated that they, vastly changed it, turned it into kind of like a Casablanca ripoff. I think he had to be more irked that the book is trash. It's the only book that I had to include at the end that I did not like. But yeah, a lot of authors, take umbrage with adaptations.
Yeah, that was a loose one, and it was a little bit of a chore to get through. Movie,
Yeah.
not so much. That was a
Yeah.
little easier than the read.
Yeah.
I think my favorite quote is Rick Riordan, who did Percy Jackson series. When the movie came out, he said it was like watching his life's work be put through a meat shredder.
Yeah. Authors get very, very, they're not often precious about certain things. I always sympathize with authors when key pieces of their works get tweaked. People ask me what's an adaptation I wish I could include in a future volume, and I always point to Don Winslow's Savages that they adapted in 2012. It's a fantastic, brutal book, and I love it so much. I've read it multiple times, and they adapted it into a very decent movie. But the ending of the book is very bleak. It's like very Tarantino-esque, like Reservoir Dogs ending. And the movie has that ending and then says psych and then does a happy ending. And I remember tweeting at Don Winslow once, just in jest, to be like, the movie's perfect. It's 97% there, except for that happy ending at the end. And he said, that was not my decision. That was Oliver Stone's who directed it. They had to put in a happy ending. And so I commiserated with him and understood. And I think that's when I tend to get like irked about an adaptation, is like changing a key piece of, the detail of what makes the book work in order to appease, like a studio or maybe an audience, survey or something is where I tend to be like, leave the book alone.
I wanted to go back to what you said about Jaws earlier, because you mentioned that not a lot of people know it was a book before it was a movie. Other than Jaws, is there any other movie where your fans or people you talk to are surprised that it came out as a book first?
Yeah, the big one of the other ones that I get a lot of people are surprised by is Anita Loos's Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, which actually is the movie, the Howard Hawks movie from the 50s with Marilyn Monroe, is actually adapted from a stage musical that was adapted from the book. So really the movie and the book have very little to do with each other. Even though one inspired the other, which inspired the other. So, and we'll see that with like The Color Purple later this year, which is they're doing an adaptation of the musical, even though they've already adapted the original Alice Walker novel, which I think is really interesting. But the Anita Loos book is very much, a Flapper era novel. It was published in 25. And it's very different than the film. And I love the film so much. It's one of my favorites. But reading the book for the first time, I was really flummoxed by like the female friendship angle is still there, but there's a lot of like, there's a heist, there's a diamond heist in it. There's a lot of like snarky stuff that the production code at the time would not have let them get away with. The little boy character that most people love about the movie is actually a grown man in the book. And the ending is very different in the film, where, Lorelei Lee, the Marilyn Monroe character, is ultimately far more conniving than she is on screen, but that's okay. She's allowed to get away with that, which actually has more in common with Anita Loos's other movie of the 1930s, Redheaded Woman. So most people are really surprised because they love the Marilyn Monroe musical. Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend is iconic. And when they find out it's based on the book, and it's got way more wacky hijinks, they're like, oh, that's different.
Now, Howard Hawks' name has come up several times already in this conversation. Honestly, one of my favorite directors. Are there any other directors that have focused a lot on adaptations or used that as their material regularly, maybe opposed to others?
Yeah, I mean, the other name that comes up frequently, I tried really hard not to reutilize directors, and it didn't always work in my favor. Spielberg loves adaptations. He's made several of them, 3 of which are in the book. So Jaws, Jurassic Park, and The Color Purple. And I think that Spielberg really gets great screenwriters that understand the art of adaptation, because all 3 of those movies, while very different genres and storytelling styles, have a magic all their own, which is fantastic. Kubrick is another one, between The Shining and Clockwork Orange. While Stephen King did not like The Shining, most people love the adaptation because of just how sophisticated the fear is, in a way that is, I say, similar to what King does in the book, even if it's not the same themes and the storytelling is different. But then you look at something like Clockwork Orange, which is very similar to the Anthony Burgess novel, but it's just relentless. I think that's what makes Kubrick work so well with adaptation, is that he is just relentless and kind of getting the themes in, which I love. Sofia Coppola is another one too. I put Virgin Suicides in the book. She's also adapted Antonia Frazier's Marie Antoinette book. And I think that, she's also another director that just gets what makes a book work and can flesh that out in a way that's just really, really effective.
Yeah, Stephen King didn't like Jack Nicholson being cast in that role, and it's just absolutely unfathomable to think of that movie without Jack, right? He thought Jack started off too crazy looking, which probably something to it.
I get it. He did eventually get his version. They did the miniseries with what is it, Steven Weber, I think, in the lead, which I don't know if that worked either. So,
hard act to follow,
Yeah, it's definitely a hard act to follow. I had never read The Shining before embarking on this project, and I knew they were very different, but I didn't realize how they were different. And I was really shocked by how that book is horror in a totally different way. The Overlook is a great location, but that's such a painful story of abuse and alcoholism that I know Mike Flanagan tried very hard to kind of work with when he did Dr. Sleep, which is both an adaptation of the King novel, but also tries to be kind of this attempt. Mike Flanagan has talked about trying to rectify and bridge the gap between the two Shinings. And I think that Dr. Sleep is probably one of my favorite contemporary movies. So I think he did the job.
A worthy effort, yeah.
Do you ever find that there's a bias when looking at comparing the two, a movie and the book, of which one you saw or read first? That maybe there's I read the book first, so I'm going to use that as the kind of the litmus test for the movie, and vice versa?
It happens all the time. I really do think that which version you look at first does affect how you see a subsequent iteration. People always ask me, like, why do people prefer the book or the movie? And I say that people that read the book first feel like they're getting the complete version. They're getting everything, and a film can only take away or add, so they feel like they're getting the purest take on that. And I think that if you do read the book first, you have that ability to kind of like armchair cast. You can kind of see things, whereas if you see the film first, case in point being Jaws, it's hard to get a perfect casting or perfect line delivery or a perfect scene out of your head. An example I use is The Talented Mr. Ripley. I love the Anthony Minghella film, and I saw the film first as a teenager, and I loved it. And when I went back and read Patricia Highsmith's book, it was really hard for me, not to have Matt Damon and Jude Law and, Gwyneth Paltrow in my head, but just to realize how cold and clinical Highsmith's text is. The big thing that Minghella's film gets praised for and condemned by Highsmith fans for is that he added in the homoerotic subtext, which is really just text in the film. That was not in the book. Highsmith does not make a judgment call if these characters are same-sex oriented. That it could be a story about class if you want it to be. It could be a story about race. It could be a story about consumerism. Yes, it can be, read as in a queer reading, but that's not the way she's approaching it. So for me, knowing that Highsmith was, a gay writer, knowing that the movie did that, I assumed that the book would be like far more, overt with that. When I went back and read it, I'm like, oh, that's actually built upon for the film. It kind of forced me to reevaluate how I approach, the book, and especially when it's dealing with minority subjects at that time, being like, oh, that changes how you expect a book to be.
Well, we can't talk about adaptations without talking about one that is just universally either loathed or loved, and that's Game of Thrones. And I'm gonna heap praise on it because I think casting is probably the thing that success hinges on more than anything else when you talk about projects like this, like we're discussing today, or really in general. Casting is king. I think that they cast that perfectly. I saw the first season, and it took me years to see the rest because I read every book as I went. And it almost helped me as I read that first book because it's a very, very deep world. It takes a while. It's heavy reading. It takes a long time to get through these books. So it almost gave me a little help as I went because I wasn't having to, use my imagination. I had kind of an idea what Jaime Lannister looked like. And I'd like to know, what's your opinion of the project that's been cast the most purely as far as portraying the characters from the book?
Oh gosh, that is tough.
I also thought No Country for Old Men did a really good job.
No Country for Old Men does a really good job.
Yeah.
It's one of those few just perfect adaptations, I
agree.
think. Yeah.
Javier
Bardem and Josh Brolin just to give that role, the respective roles, their all. It's fantastic. Another one I throw out is the Joy Luck Club. I think that perfectly encapsulates the characters and the Virgin Suicides. Watching the Virgin Suicides, it is impossible not to see Kirsten Dunst in that role. It's a perfectly cast film that goes so well with kind of the apathy and the ethereal beauty of the text. So those ones definitely get my love.
What books are out there that might be on your list of favorites that you'd like to see be adapted that haven't yet?
Oh gosh, I have so many. The ones that my list originally had far too many Dennis Lehane adaptations, and they said, Kristen, you can't do Dennis Lehane's entire filmography. You have to take them out, which broke my heart. Because I had pitched the book, and Mystic River was one of my sample chapters. So I was very bummed that I didn't get to include any. But I would love for them to adapt. I know Ben Affleck a couple years ago did Gone Baby Gone, which is a very worthy adaptation of Dennis Lehane's Kenzie Gennaro series. But the second book in that series, Darkness Take My Hand, I've read it more than once, and every time I read it, I can see the world. It is a dark, sad, like bitter, gloomy world with like a huge gun battle at the end that I can just like see. I can see the soundtrack. I can see all of it. And I need them to do it. I know Apple was talking about doing a series, and that has now gone by the wayside. So I'm trying to manifest again the adaptation of that one. And a lot of Matt Ruff's books. He's the author who wrote the book that became Lovecraft Country. For better or worse, whether you like Lovecraft Country or not, the book is so distinct. You read it and you never forget it. But he has written just several books that are like that, where you read them and the plots are so inventive and they're so vibrant. And you're just like, how is this man not the new Dennis Lehane, where we're just adapting all of his stuff? So those are the two authors that I bring up. We need to be seeing more from them. I am ready for this.
Well, we've talked about fiction up to this point. There are a lot of wonderful films made from nonfiction. I think of Killers of the Flower Moon. Just received a wonderful response at Cannes and from the Osage Native American community. Scorsese apparently has another epic on his hands. Another movie that supposedly he has optioned, I understand DiCaprio is also attached to, potentially Keanu Reeves, is The Devil in the White City by Eric Larson, which is probably my favorite nonfiction book of all times. And I'm really looking forward to seeing if that actually comes to fruition. Anything on the horizon for you that you're really looking forward to seeing? Adaptations that maybe you've heard of, we haven't? Anything inside LA?
Nothing that I have heard of yet. I am very behind on my reading. I know that, they're doing Nosferatu again.
Yes.
Robert Eggers is adapting it. And
with Willem Dafoe attached now, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. And, I, as somebody who has read and studied Dracula, again, college education, you don't get away from reading Bram Stoker. I'm ready for that one to see, like, can we build on that at this point? Or are we just done with it? I still have to read Killers of the Flower Moon. I know they were talking about adapting Grady Hendrix's book Final Girl Support Club a couple years ago for HBO. I don't know if that's still happening, but I hope it is, because the book is very much in the Yellow Jackets vein, if you're into that. It's a very fascinating, fun book. So no, I mean, people keep asking me about, like, oh, what books are you going to include for volume 2? I'm like, it is so hard to keep up now, like, because everything is content. So
Yeah.
it's I used to feel like I was kind of in the know. It was easy to like Google like movies based on books, and you maybe had enough to fill a year. Now you have like enough to fill like 12 years. It's impossible.
Do you think it's possible to encapsulate a book in, the 90, 120, 180 minutes of a feature film? I like seeing movies become series because they can spend so much more time and really break you get a lot more meat from the book, I guess, that way. Are there any series that you're pleased were series rather than a film based on a book?
Yeah, it's interesting. The one that always pops up is Todd Haynes adapted Mildred Pierce into a miniseries for HBO. And it's a great example of a way that a movie can be just as good as the book and its subsequent miniseries. It's one of those examples like Jurassic Park, where one I don't think loses anything by the other existing. And the book is very dark, it's very disturbing. And that could not be done in 1945. You couldn't have this incestuous mother-daughter story where everybody's drinking and everybody's sleeping around and your lead character is a middle-aged woman, finding her sexuality. You couldn't do that with Joan Crawford. And Todd Haynes, I think, very lovingly translated the book again and gave us a very, dour, heart-wrenching performance from Kate Winslet that has that little air of camp to it that Haynes is known for. So I think that series really, really gets it right. The other one I throw out is I read all of Charlaine Harris's Sookie Stackhouse novels when True Blood was a thing. And while that series heavily diverged by the end of the book series, there were a couple books that they adapted for various seasons of that series that were really fun. So I think that's another good example.
Well, the book is called Have You Read the Book? But that's not the only thing you've got going on. You've also got a podcast. Tell us a little bit about that and how your work as a writer, maybe how that informs your work as a podcaster.
Some ticklish business.
Yeah, I do. And what little free time I have, when I'm not full-time, film editor for The Wrap, I do my podcast Ticklish Business with my co-hosts Samantha Ellis and Emily Edwards, and we are big classic film nuts who, much like this book hopefully gets people to read. We want people to love old Hollywood. So we talk about movies before 1970-ish. Get to interview some great people, talk about some classic films, give some weird thoughts on people that have been dead for, several decades. And it's a lot of fun. We just recently did an episode on the 1930s film, The Story of Temple Drake, which is a film in the 1930s about sexual assault. And it's got a fantastic leading performance that was not nominated for an Oscar based on a book by William Faulkner. So it's definitely been great to talk about different books from that era when adaptations were, prioritized. We just recorded an episode about the Oxbow incident. And one of the things I noticed is the trailer for that movie is just Henry Fonda holding the book up, being like, if you've read this book, you want to see the movie. They don't show anything from the movie. It's just him holding up the book. And I love that. I love that in the 1940s, you didn't have to show any clips from the movie. You just had to tell people, you liked this thing, so come see this thing, and you will be just as happy.
Man, we have covered a lot of ground. I'm literally like adding to my Goodreads account as you're mentioning stuff. I just ordered Mildred Pierce from the library and added the HBO series to my Real Good account. We're just nerding out over here. But how do people keep up with you? I know you're on Instagram and you've got the podcast website. What's the best way for people to keep up with your new projects and what you're up to?
Yeah, you can always find my writing over at thewrap.com. I'm on Twitter and Instagram most frequently at Kristen Lopez 88. I'm also vaguely on TikTok, but I still am not down with the kids on that one. And then Ticklish Business is on all podcast platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher. And we do have a Twitter at ticklish_biz, as well as a Facebook and Instagram at ticklishbiz. And we do a really fun Patreon that has all sorts of bonus stuff. That's at patreon.com/ticklishbiz.
Oh, that's great.
You are one busy person.
Yeah, big time. We're definitely kindred spirits with all of our interests here. So it's been an absolute pleasure. Best of luck with the book. Next time you make it up Seattle direction, definitely look us up.
Will
Love
do.
to get our copies signed.
Yes, anytime. Yes. Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. Thank you. Thank you again to our guest, Kristen Lopez. But Have You Read the Book is available now everywhere fine books are sold, and her podcast, Ticklish Business, can be heard on all major podcast platforms. You can find her writing at therap.com, and she's on Instagram and Twitter at KristenLopez88, all linked in the show notes.
And if you enjoyed episode 76, please make sure to follow us and share the podcast with a friend. You can find all the latest on HeilmanandHaber.com. Plus, all of our past episodes, stage reviews, and popular segments like Get to Know a Theater, In the Mix, and behind-the-scenes artist interviews. As always, thank you for supporting local theater and for joining us on Heilman and Haber.